We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and these are the works of Josephus, complete and unabridged, the new updated edition. Publication 1988. Underneath is a description. Overview. This renowned reference book has served scholars, pastors, students, and those interested in the background of the New Testament for years. The insight given into the Essene community, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the interpretation and traditions of the Old Testament in 1st century Judaism is invaluable. The outlook of Josephus, a late 1st century Pharisee and historian, on Jesus and the New Testament documents is enlightening and provocative. As an original reference, the works of Josephus is essential to a full understanding of the 1st century, the time of Christ, and the New Testament. Complete and unabridged, this is the best one-volume edition of the classic translation of Josephus's work. The entire text has been reset in modern, easy-to-read type, numbering corresponding to that used in the Loeb edition has been added to the text, and citations and cross-references have been updated from Roman numerals to Arabic numbers. Includes index, introduction, Life of Flavius Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Preface, Book 1, From the Creation to the Death of Isaac, From the Death of Isaac to the Exodus out of Egypt, and so forth. Includes biographical references and index notes, obscured text, inherent front cover, cut off text. And we found this in the public domain, public access, so it shouldn't be a problem with copyright claims, and there was no copyright infringement intended. And this video, in regards to this particular book, is for educational purposes only. We hope you enjoy it. The Works of Josephus, complete and unabridged, new updated edition, translated by William Whiston, A.M. Contents page. Continued. Introduction. Flavius Josephus, AD 37 to C 100, which died about 100 AD, is the author of what has become for Christianity perhaps the most significant extra-biblical writings of the 1st century. His works are the principal source for the history of the Jews, from the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, BC 175 to 163, to the fall of Masada in AD 73, and therefore are of incomparable value for determining the setting of late intertestamental and New Testament times. Josephus, born the son of a priest, was named Joseph ben Matthias, Joseph son of Matthias, being of a priestly family and a descendant of the Hasmoneans. He was well educated and rose to a respected position in the Jewish community. After a short association with the Essenes and a somewhat longer period as a disciple of an ascetic hermit named Banus, he decided at the age of 19 to join the Pharisees. When he was 26, AD 63, he travelled to Rome and successfully pleaded for the release of some fellow priests who had been sent there to be tried by Nero. As a result of the visit, he returned profoundly impressed by the power of the empire and strongly opposed the Jewish revolt against Rome in AD 66, being convinced of its ultimate futility and fearing the consequences for his nation. Being unable to restrain the rebellion, he reluctantly joined it and assumed a command in Galilee, where he fortified a number of cities, stored up provisions, and trained his army in anticipation of the arrival of Vespasian and his forces. By the spring of AD 67, Josephus and the little that remained of his army had been forced to retreat to the fortified city of Jotapata, where he eventually surrendered. During his subsequent imprisonment, Josephus became directly acquainted with and gained favour of Vespasian. When Vespasian became emperor in AD 69, through rather extraordinary circumstances, Josephus was officially freed. He returned to Jerusalem with Titus, Vespasian's son and future emperor, where he served the Roman commander as interpreter and mediator. Faced with the inevitability of the Roman forces' ultimate victory, Josephus attempted to convince the Jews holding Jerusalem to surrender and thus save the city. He was, however, unsuccessful, and in AD 70 the city fell to the Romans and was demolished. After the destruction of Jerusalem, Josephus returned to Rome with Titus and settled there as a client of the emperor on an imperial pension, gaining the rights of a Roman citizen and adopting the emperor's family name, Flavius, and began his literary endeavours. His works, The Wars of the Jews, his first work, The Wars of the Jews, was written to give a general history of the wars from the time of the Maccabees to the Great War of Rome, which resulted in the final demise of the nation of Israel. Josephus' eyewitness account of the last years of resistance and particularly of the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus are most valuable to a proper understanding of those events. Josephus' other major work, and his longest, The Antiquities of the Jews, published some 20 years later, was written primarily for the benefit of the non-Jewish world. It is a history of the Jewish nation from earliest times. He begins with an account of the biblical creation narrative to Josephus' own time and was intended to demonstrate that the Jews enjoyed an even greater antiquity than did the Greeks. The work draws heavily from the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, or the LXX, and extra biblical traditions, as well as the writings of Greek and the Roman histories. His autobiography, The Life of Flavius Josephus, was published as an appendix to the Antiquities and was written primarily to defend himself in his war record against the unflattering portrayal given in the work of another Jewish historian, Justus of Tiberias, against Apion. Is a short and eloquent apologetic for the Jewish faith in contrast with various aspects of Greek thought. It is difficult to overemphasize the contribution of Josephus to our understanding of the social, political, and religious milieu of the New Testament era. While it is clear that Josephus was not completely unbiased in his writing, as is evident from his occasional apologetic tone, he is nevertheless very reliable as a historian and deserving of careful study by the serious reader. About this new updated edition. The English translation upon which this edition is based first appeared in 1736. William Whiston, 1667 to 1752. The translator was a rather diversified individual, having noteworthy accomplishments in the areas of mathematics, philosophy, and theology. His is, without a doubt, the best known and most widely read English translation of the works of Josephus. While there is no doubt that with the availability of better texts as well as more qualified and better equipped translators, improvements couldn't be made in Whiston's translation. It is still the most accessible, complete English translation currently available. In the present edition, the entire text of Whiston's work, his translation of Josephus' writings, with his accompanying notes as well as his essays, or dissertations, in the appendix, has been re-typeset in modern, easy-to-read type. Apart from the updating of a few spellings and the conversion of Roman numerals into Arabic numerals, i.e. into modern numbers, the original work has been left unchanged, with one major exception. A new numbering system has been added to enhance the usefulness of this important work for the modern reader. With the appearance of Josephus' writings in the Loeb Classical Library series, published by Harvard University Press, scholars began to refer to passages in Josephus by citing the numbers used in the Greek text instead of the old numbering system used by Whiston. As a result, it became practically impossible for the average reader with Whiston's translation to locate the passage in Josephus to which a modern commentary or other reference work might refer. The present edition solves this problem. It not only gives the original Whiston numbering in each work, but it also has included in parentheses throughout the text numbers corresponding to those used in the Greek text, making it an easy matter to locate any passage using either citation method. A great deal of change and advancement has been made in scholarship on Josephus and in the areas of biblical studies relating to his works since Whiston produced his notes and essays to accompany his translation. It is not at all surprising that the modern reader will undoubtedly find some of his notes and essays archaic, and while it goes almost without saying that one would certainly be well advised to also consult more current work on any particular aspect of interpretation or controversy raised by Whiston, there is nonetheless a good deal of useful information to be gleaned from his efforts. Besides containing some valuable and helpful insights in their own right, the notes and essays provide a window for the serious reader interested in the history of scholarship. The Works of Josephus. The life of Flavius Josephus. 1. The family from which I am derived is not an ignoble one, but have descended all along from the priests, and as nobility among several people is of a different origin, so with us to be of the sacerdotal dignity is an indication of the splendour of a family. 2. Now I am not only sprung from a sacerdotal family in general, but from the first of the 24. It has a footnote indicated there as A, and below it says here, we may hence correct the error of the Latin copy of the second book against Apion 8, for the Greek is there lost, which says they were then only 4 tribes or courses of the priests instead of 24. Nor is this testimony to be disregarded, as if Josephus there contradicted what he had affirmed here, because even the account there given better agrees to 24 than to 4 courses, while he says that each of these courses contained about 5,000 men, which, multiplied by only 4, will make not more than 20,000 priests, whereas the number 120,000, as multiplied by 24, seems much the most probable, they being about 1/10 of the whole people, even after the captivity. See Ezra 2:36-39, Nehemiah 7:39-42, 1 Ezra 5:24-25, with Ezra 2:64, Nehemiah 7:66, 1 Ezra 5:41. Nor will this common reading or notion of but 4 courses of priests agree with Josephus' own further assertion elsewhere, Antiquities 7:14-7, that David's partition of the priests into 24 courses had continued to that day. Now I am not only sprung from a sacerdotal family in general, but from the first of the 24 courses, and as among us there is not only a considerable difference between one family of that first course also, nay, further, by my mother I am of the royal blood, for the children of Asmoneus, from whom that family was derived, had both the office of the high priesthood and the dignity of a king for a long time together. 3. I will accordingly set down my progenitors in order. My grandfather's father was named Simon, with the addition of Silas. He lived at the same time with that son of Simon the high priest, who first of all the high priest was named Hyrcanus. This Simon Silas had 9 sons, 4, one of whom was Matthias, called Elias. He married the daughter of Jonathan the high priest, which Jonathan was the first of the sons of Asmoneus, who was high priest and was the brother of Simon the high priest also. This Matthias had a son called Matthias Curtis, and that in the first year of the government of Hyrcanus. 5. His son's name was Joseph, born in the 9th year of the reign of Alexander. His son Matthias was born in the 10th year of the reign of Archelaus. It's one of the sons of Herod. When Herod died, he sat on the throne, or his place of authority. As I was born to Matthias in the 1st year of the reign of Caius Caesar. I have 3 sons. Hyrcanus, the eldest, was born in the 4th year of the reign of Vespasian, as was Justus, born in the 7th, and Agrippa in the 9th. 6. Thus I have set down the genealogy of my family as I have found described, footnote B, an eminent example of the care of the Jews about the genealogies, especially as to the priests. See against Apion by Josephus 1:7. I have set down the genealogy of my family as I have found described in the public records, and so bid adieu, was it a Jew, to those who calumniate me as of a lower original. 2. 7. Now, my father Matthias was not only eminent on account of his nobility, but had a high commendation on account of his righteousness, and was in great reputation in Jerusalem, the greatest city in the city we have lost. It's the greatest city we have. 8. I was myself brought up with my brother, whose name was Matthias, for he was my own brother by both father and mother, and I made mighty proficiency in the improvements of my learning, and appeared to have both a great memory and understanding. 9. Moreover, when I was a child and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning, on which account the high priest and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together, in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of the law. 10. And when I was about 16 years old, I had a mind to make trial of the several sects that were among us. These sects are 3. The first is that of the Pharisees, the second that of the Sadducees, and the third that of the Essenes, as we have frequently told you. For I thought that by this means I might choose the best, if I were once acquainted with them all. 11. So I contented myself with hard fare, and underwent great difficulties, and went through them all. Nor did I content myself with these trials only, but when I was informed that one, whose name was Banus, lived in the desert and used no other clothing than grew upon trees. So maybe he had bark as clothing. Apparently that's what they used to do in India. Take the bark off the tree and use it as clothing. And had no other food than what grew of its own accord, and bathed himself in cold water frequently, both by night and by day. In order to preserve his chastity, I imitated him in those things. 12. And continued with him 3 years. Footnote below. C. When Josephus here says that from 16 to 19, or for 3 years, he made trial of the 3 Jewish sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, and yet says presently, in all our copies, that he stayed besides with one particular ascetic called Banus, part auto with him, and this still before he was 19. There is little room left for his trial of the 3 other sects, I suppose, therefore part auto with him the old. Reading might be xerophagia with them, which is a very small emendation and takes away the difficulty before us. Nor is Dr. Hudson's conjecture hinted at by Mr. Hall in his preface to the Doctor's edition of Josephus at all improbable. That this Banus, by this his description, might well be a follower of John the Baptist, and that from him Josephus might easily imbibe such notions, as afterward prepared him to have a favourable opinion of Jesus Christ himself, who was attested to by John the Baptist. So when I had accomplished my desires, I returned back to the city, being now 19 years old, and began to conduct myself according to the rules of the sect of the Pharisees, which is of kin to the sect of the Stoics, as the Greeks called them. So pretty much similar. Or related. 3. 13. But when I was in the 26th year of my age, it happened that I took a voyage to Rome, and this on the occasion which I shall now describe. At the time when Felix was procurator of Judea, there were certain priests of my acquaintance, and very excellent persons they were, whom on a small and trifling occasion he had put into bonds and sent to Rome to plead their cause before Caesar. So he basically took them captive. 14. These I was desirous to procure deliverance for, and that especially because I was informed that they were not unmindful of piety towards God, even under their afflictions, but supported themselves with figs and nuts. D. We may note here that religious men among the Jews, or at least those that were priests, were sometimes ascetics also, and like Daniel and his companions in Babylon, Daniel 1:8-16, ate no flesh, but figs and nuts, etc. only. This was like the par or tois or austere diet of the Christian ascetics in Passion Week. Constitution, verse 18. Accordingly, I came to Rome, though with through a great number of hazards by sea. 15. For as our ship was drowning in the Adriatic Sea, we that were in it, being about 600 in number, it has been thought the number of Paul and his companions on shipboard, Acts 27:38, or on board a ship, which are 276, and our copies are too many, whereas we find here that Josephus and his companions, a very few years after the other, were about 600. They swam for their lives all the night, when upon the first appearance of the day, and upon our sight of a ship of Cyrene, I and some others, 8 in all, by God's providence, prevented the rest, and were taken up into the other ship. And when I had thus escaped, and was come to Dicearchia, which the Italians called Puteoli, I became acquainted with Aliturius, an actor of plays, and much beloved by Nero, but a Jew by birth, and through his interest became known to Poppaea, Caesar's wife, and took care as soon as possible to entreat her to procure that the priests might be set at liberty. And when, besides this favour, I had obtained many presents from Poppaea, I returned home again. 4. And now I perceived innovations were already begun, and that there were a great many very much elevated, in hopes of a revolt from the Romans. I therefore endeavoured to put a stop to these tumultuous persons, and persuaded them to change their minds, and laid before their eyes against whom it was that they were going to fight, and told them that they were inferior to the Romans, not only in master skill, but also in good fortune, and desired them not to rashly and after the most foolish manner to bring on the dangers of the most terrible mischiefs upon their country, upon their families, and upon themselves. And this I said with vehement exhortation, because I foresaw that the end of such a war would be most unfortunate to us. But I could not persuade them, for the madness of desperate men was quite too hard for me. 5. I was then afraid, lest by inculcating these things so often, I should incur their hatred and their suspicions, as if I were of our enemy's party, and should run into the danger of being seized by them and slain, since they were already possessed of Antonia. It's the fortress in Jerusalem, the Roman fortress, where they used to look over the inner courts, etc., and squish any sort of fights or rebellions going on. Supposedly, according to that brother Nathaniel, that Wailing Wall is actually the remaining wall of that fortress. The actual Temple of Jerusalem is further down in Jerusalem. Antonia, which was a citadel. So I retired into the inner court of the temple. Yet did I go out of the temple again, after Menahem and the principal of the band of robbers were put to death, when I abode among the high priest and the chief of the Pharisees. But no small fear seized upon us when we saw the people in arms, while we ourselves knew not what we should do, and were not able to restrain the seditious. However, as the danger was directly upon us, we pretended that we were of the same opinion with them, but only advised them to be quiet for the present and to let the enemy go away, still hoping that Gesius Florus would not be long ere he came, and that with great forces, and so put an end to these seditious proceedings. But upon his coming and fighting, he was beaten, and a great many of those that were with him fell. And this disgrace which Gesius with Cestius received became the calamity of our whole nation. For those that were fond of the war were so far elevated with the success that they had hopes of finally conquering the Romans, of which war another occasion was ministered, which was this: those that dwelt in the neighbouring cities of Syria seized upon such Jews as dwelt among them with their wives and children, and slew them when they had not the least occasion of complaint against them. For they did neither attempt any innovation or revolt from the Romans, nor had they given any marks of hatred or treacherous designs toward the Syrians. But what was done by the inhabitants of Scythopolis was the most impious and most highly criminal of all. See Jewish Wars 2:18-3. For when the Jews, their enemies, came upon them from without, they forced the Jews that were among them to bear arms against their own countrymen, which it is unlawful for us to do. It's Jews, right? G. Footnote below. The Jews might collect this unlawfulness of fighting against the brethren from the law of Moses, Leviticus 19:6. Thou shalt not stand against the blood of thy neighbour, and that, verse 17, thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself, as well as from many other places in the Pentateuch and Prophets. See Antiquities 8:8-3. For when the Jews, their enemies, came upon them from without, they forced the Jews that were among them to bear arms against their own countrymen, which is unlawful for us to do. And when by their assistance they had joined battle with those who attacked them, and had beaten them, after that victory they forgot the assurances they had given these their fellow citizens and confederates, and slew them all, being in number many 10,000s, 13,000. The like miseries were undergone by those Jews that were the inhabitants of Damascus. But we have given a more accurate account of these things in the books of the Jewish war. I only mention them now because I would demonstrate to my readers that the Jews' war with the Romans was not voluntary, but that for the main they were forced by necessity to enter into it. So when Gesius had been beaten, as we have said already, the principal men of Jerusalem, seeing that the robbers and innovators had arms in great plenty, and fearing lest they, while they were unprovided with arms, should be in subjection to the enemies, which also came to be the case afterward, and being informed that all Galilee had not yet revolted from the Romans, but that some part of it was still quiet, they sent me, Josephus, and 2 others of the priests, who were men of excellent character, Joazar and Judas, in order to persuade the ill men there to lay down their arms, and to teach them this lesson, that it were better to have those arms reserved for the most courageous men that the nation had, than to be kept there, for that it had been resolved that those our best men should always have their arms ready against futurity, but still so that they should wait to see what the Romans would do. When I had therefore received these instructions, I came into Galilee, and found the people of Sepphoris in no small agony about their country, by reason that the Galileans had resolved to plunder it on account of the friendship they had with the Romans, and because they had given their right hand and made a league with Cestius Gallus, the president of Syria. But I delivered them all out of the fear that they were in, and persuading the multitude to deal kindly with them, and permitted them to send to those that were their own hostages with Lysias to Dora, which is a city of Phoenicia, as often as they pleased, though I still found the inhabitants of Tiberias ready to take arms, and that on the occasion following. There were 3 factions in the city. The first was composed of men of worth and gravity. Of these Julius Capellus was the head. Now he, as well as all his companions, Herod the son of Meadas, and Herod the son of Gamaliel, and Compsus the son of Compsus, for as to Compsus's brother Crispus, who had once been governor of the city under the great king. That this Herod Agrippa the father was of old calling a great king, as here appears by his coins still remaining, to which Haverkamp refers us. As to Compus's brother Crispus, who had once been governor of the city under the great king Agrippa, he was beyond Jordan in his own possessions. All those persons before named gave their advice that the city should then continue in their allegiance to the Romans and to the king. But Pistis, who was guided by his son Justus, did not acquiesce in that resolution. Otherwise he was himself naturally of a good and virtuous character. But the second faction was composed of the most ignoble persons, and was determined for war. But as for Justus, the son of Pistis, who was the head of the third faction, although he pretended to be doubtful about going to war, yet was he really desirous of innovation, and supposing that he should gain power to himself by the changes of affairs. He therefore came into the midst of them, and endeavoured to inform the multitude that the city Tiberias had ever been a city of Galilee, and that in the days of Herod the Tetrarch, who had built it, because he was a great architect, etc., it had obtained the principal place, and that he had ordered that the city Sepphoris should be subordinate to the city Tiberias, that they had not lost this preeminence even under Agrippa the father, but had retained it until Felix was procurator of Judea. But he told them that now they had been so unfortunate as to be made a present by Nero to Agrippa Jr., and that upon Sepphoris' submission of itself to the Romans, that was become the capital city of Galilee, and that the royal treasury and the archives were now removed from them. When he had spoken these things, and a great many were many more against King Agrippa, in order to provoke the people to a revolt, he added that this was the time for them to take arms and join with the Galileans as their confederates, whom they might command, and who would now willingly assist them, out of the hatred they bear to the people of Sepphoris, because they preserve their fidelity to the Romans, and to a great number of forces, in order to punish them. And as he said this, he exhorted the multitude to go to war, for his abilities lay in making harangues to the people, and in being too hard in his speeches for such as opposed him, though they advised what was more to their advantage, and this by his craftiness and his fallacies, for he was not unskilful in the learning of the Greeks, and in dependence on that skill it was that he undertook to write a history of these affairs, as aiming by this way of haranguing to disguise the truth. But as to this man, and how ill were his character and conduct of life, and how he and his brother were, in great measure, the authors of our destruction, I shall give this reader an account of the progress of my narration. So when Justus had, by his persuasions, prevailed with the citizens of Tiberias to take arms, nay, and had forced a great many so to do against their wills, he went out and set the villages that belonged to Gadara and Hippos on fire, which villages were situated on the borders of Tiberias and of the region of Scythopolis. And this was the state Tiberias, was now in. But as for Gishgala, its affairs were thus: when John the son of Levi saw some of the citizens much elevated upon their revolt from the Romans, he laboured to restrain them, and entreated them that they would keep their allegiance to them. But he could not gain his purpose, although he did his endeavours to the utmost. For the neighbouring people of Gabara and Surgana with the Tyrians got together a great army and fell upon Gishgala, and took Gishgala by force and set it on fire, and when they had entirely demolished it, they returned home. Upon which John was so enraged that he armed all his men and joined battle with the people forementioned, and rebuilt Gishgala after a manner better than before, and fortified it with walls for its future security. But Gamala preserved in its allegiance to the Romans for the reason following: Philip, the son of Josephus, who was the governor under King Agrippa, had been unexpectedly preserved when the royal palace at Jerusalem had been besieged, but as he fled away, had fallen into another danger, and that was of being killed by Menahem and the robbers that were with him. But certain Babylonians, who were of his kindred, and were then in Jerusalem, hindered the robbers from executing their design. So Philip stayed there 4 days and fled away on the 5th, having disguised himself with fictitious hair, maybe he wore a wig, that he might not be discovered. And when he was come to one of the villages to him belonging, but one that was situated at the borders of the citadel of Gamala, he sent to some of those that were under him, and commanded them to come to him. But God himself hindered his intention, and this for his own advantage also. For it had not so happened, he had certainly perished for a fever, having seized upon him immediately. He wrote to Agrippa and Bernice. Not too sure if that was at Bernice that actually went to Golgotha and found the cross, or bits or pieces of it, the wood, etc., because she believed in the Christ eventually, and she went on a mission there, and gave them to one of his freedmen to carry them to Varus, who at this time was procurator of the kingdom, which the king and his sister had entrusted him withal, while they were gone to Berytus with an intention of meeting Gesius. When Varus had received these letters of Philip, and had learned that he was preserved, he was very uneasy at it, as supposed that he would appear useless to the king and his sister. Now Philip was come. He therefore produced a carrier of the letters before the multitude, and accused him of forging the same, and said that he spake falsely when he related that Philip was at Jerusalem, fighting among the Jews against the Romans. So he slew him, he killed him. And when this freedman of Philip did not return again, Philip was doubtful what should be the occasion of his stay, and sent a second messenger with letters, that he might upon his return inform him what had befallen the other that had been sent before, and why he tarried so long. Varus accused this messenger also when he came of telling a falsehood, and slew him, killed him, for he was puffed up by the Syrians that were at Caesarea, and had great expectations, for they said that Agrippa would be slain by the Romans for the crimes which the Jews had committed, and that he should himself take the government as derived from their kings, for Varus was by the confession of all of the royal family as being a descendant of Sohemus, who had enjoyed a tetrarchy about Libanus, for which reasons it was that he was puffed up and kept the letters to himself. He contrived also that the king should not meet with those writings, by guarding all the passes, lest anyone should escape, and inform the king what had been done. He moreover slew many of the Jews, in order to gratify the Syrians of Caesarea. He had a mind also to join with the Chaconites in Batanea, and to take up arms and make an assault upon the Babylonian Jews that were at Ecbatana, for that was the name they went by. He therefore called to him 12 of the Jews of Caesarea of the best character, and ordered them to go to Ecbatana and inform the countrymen who dwelt there. Then Varus hath heard that you intend to march against the king, but not believing that report, he hath sent us to persuade you to lay down your arms, and that this compliance will be a sign that he did well not to give credit to those that raised the report concerning you. He also enjoined them to send 70 of their principal men to make a defence for them as to the accusations laid against them. So when the 12 messengers came to the countrymen at Ecbatana and found that they had no designs of innovation at all, they persuaded them to send the 70 men also, who, not at all suspecting what would come, sent them accordingly. So the 70 went down to Caesarea, together with the 12 ambassadors, where Varus met them with the king's forces, and slew them all, together with the 12 ambassadors, and made an expedition against the Jews of Ecbatana. But one there was of the 70 who escaped, and made haste to inform the Jews of their coming, upon which they took their arms with their wives and children, and retired to the citadel at Gamala, leaving their own villages full of all sorts of good things, and having many 10,000 of cattle therein. When Philip was informed of these things, he also came to the citadel of Gamala, and when he was come, the multitude cried aloud, and desired him to resume the government, and to make an expedition against Varus and the Syrians of Caesarea. For it was reported that they had slain the king, or they killed the king. But Philip restrained their zeal, and put them in mind of the benefits the king had bestowed upon them, and told them how powerful the Romans were, and said it was not for their advantage to make war with them, and at length he prevailed with them. But now, when the king was acquainted with Varius's design, which was to cut off the Jews of Caesarea, being many 10,000s with their wives and children, and all in one day, he called to him Equiculus Modius, and sent him to be Varus's successor, as we have us related. But still Philip kept possession of the citadel of Gamala, and of the country adjoining to it, which thereby continued in their obedience to the Romans. Now, as soon as I was come into Galilee, and had learned the state of things by the information of such as told me of them, I wrote to the Sanhedrin at Jerusalem about them, and required their direction what I should do. Their direction was that I should continue there, and that if my fellow legates were willing, I should join with them in the care of Galilee. But those my fellow legates, having gotten great riches from those tithes which as priests were their Jews, and were given to them, determined to return to their own country. Yet when I desired them to stay so long that we might first settle the public affairs, they complied with me. So I removed together with them from the city of Sepphoris, and came to a certain village called Bethmaus, four furlongs distance from Tiberias. And thence I sent messengers to the Senate of Tiberias, and desired that the principal men of the city would come to me. And when they were come, Justus himself being also with them, I told them that I was sent to them by the people of Jerusalem as a legate, together with these other priests, in order to persuade them to demolish that house which Herod the Tetrarch had built there, and which had figures of living creatures in it. So was it full of idols? Although our laws have forbidden us to make any such figures. It must be idols. And I desired that they would give us leave so to do immediately. But for a good while Capelius and the principal men belonging to the city would not give us leave, but were at length entirely overcome by us, and were induced to be of our opinion. So Jesus, the son of Cepheus, one of those whom we have already mentioned as leader of a seditious tumult of mariners and poor people, prevented us, and took with him certain Galileans, and set the entire palace on fire, and thought he should get a great deal of money with thereby, because he saw some of the roofs gifted or gilt with gold. They also plundered a great deal of the furniture, which was done without our approbation. For after we had discoursed with Capellus and the principal men of the city, we departed from Bethmaus, and went into the upper Galilee. But Jesus and his party slew all the Greeks that were inhabitants of Tiberias, and as many others as were the enemies before the war began. When I understood the state of things, I was greatly provoked, and went down to Tiberias, and took all the care I could of the royal furniture, to recover all that could be recovered from such as had plundered it. They consisted of candlesticks made of Corinthian brass, and of royal tables, and of a great quantity of uncoined silver, and I resolved to preserve whatsoever came to my hand for the king. So I sent for 10 of the principal men of the Senate, and for Capellus the son of Antilius, to this, and committed the furniture to them with this charge, that they should part with it to nobody else but to myself. From thence I and my fellow legates went to Gishgala, to John, as desirous to know his intentions, and soon saw that he was for innovation, and had a mind to the principality. For he desired me to give him authority to carry off that corn which belonged to Caesar, and lay in the villages of Upper Galilee, and he presented that he would expend what came to in building the walls of his own city. But when I perceived what he endeavoured at, and what he had in his mind, I said I would not permit him to do so. For that I thought either to keep it for the Romans or for myself. Now I was entrusted with the public affairs there by the people of Jerusalem. But when he was not able to prevail with me, he betook himself to my fellow legates, for they had no sagacity in providing for futurity, and were very ready to take bribes, so he corrupted them with money to decree that all that corn which was within his province should be delivered to him, while I, who was but one, was outwitted by two, and held my tongue. Then did John introduce another cunning contrivance of his, for he said that those Jews who inhabited Caesarea Philippi, and were shut up by the order of the king's deputy there, had sent him to desire him, that since they had no oil that was pure for their use, he would provide a sufficient quantity of such oil for them, lest they should be forced to make use of oil that came from the Greeks, and thereby transgress their own laws. Now this was said by John, not out of his regard to religion, but out of his most flagrant desire of gain, for he knew that 2 sectaries were sold with them of Caesarea for 1 drachma, some sort of coin, Roman coin or something, but that at Gishgala 40 sectaries were sold for 4 sectaries. So he gave order that all the oil which was there should be carried away, as having my permission for doing so, which yet I did not grant him voluntarily, but only out of fear of the multitude, of the mass of people, since if I had forbidden him, I should have been stoned by them. Yeah, they would have threw rocks at him, killed him. When I had therefore permitted this to be done by John, he gave vast sums of money by this his knavery. But when I had dismissed my fellow legates and sent them back to Jerusalem, I took care to have arms provided in the cities fortified, and when I had sent for the most hardy among the robbers, I saw that it was not in my own power to take the arms from them. But I persuaded the multitude to allow their money as pay, and told them it was better for them to give them a little willingly, rather than to be forced to overlook them when they plundered their goods from them. And when I obliged them to take an oath not to come into their country unless they were invited to come, or else when they had not had their pay given them, I dismissed them and charged them neither to make an expedition against the Romans nor against those their neighbours that lay round about them. For my first care was to keep Galilee in peace. So I was willing to have the principle of the Galileans and all 70 as hostages for their fidelity, but still under the notion of friendship. Accordingly, I made them my friends and companions as I journeyed and set them to judge causes, and with their approbation it was that I gave my sentences, while I endeavoured not to mistake what justice required, and to keep my hands clear of all bribery in those determinations. Now I was now about the 30th year of my age, in which time of life it is a hard thing for anyone to escape the calumnies of the envious, although he restrained himself from fulfilling any unlawful desires, especially where a person is in great authority. Yet I did preserve every woman free from injuries, and as to what presents were offered me, I despised them as not standing in need of them, nor indeed would I take those tithes which were due to me as a priest from those that brought them. Yet do I confess that I took part of the spoils of those Syrians which inhabited the cities and cities that adjoined to us, when I had conquered them, and that I sent them to my kindred at Jerusalem. Although when I twice took Sepphoris by force, and Tiberias 4 times, in Gadara once, and when I had subdued and taken John, who often laid treacherous snares for me, I did not punish with death either him or any of the people forenamed, as the progress of this discourse will show. And on this account, I suppose it was that God, here's a footnote below, our Josephus shows, both here and everywhere, that he was a most religious person, and one that had a deep sense of God and his providence upon his mind, and ascribed all his numerous and wonderful escapes and preservations in times of danger to God's blessing him and taking care of him, and this on account of his acts of piety, justice, humanity, and charity to the Jews, his brethren, or his brothers, or his fellow people, right? Fellow men. I suppose it was that God, who is never unacquainted with those that do as they ought to do, delivered me still out of the hands of these my enemies, and afterwards preserved me when I fell into those many dangers which I shall relate hereafter. Now the multitude of the Galileans had that great kindness for me and fidelity to me, that when their cities were taken by force, and their wives and children carried into slavery, they did not so deeply lament for their own calamities, as they were solicitous for my preservation. But when John saw this, he envied me, and wrote to me, desiring that I would give him leave to come down and make use of the hot baths of Tiberias for the recovery of the health of his body. Accordingly, I did not hinder him, as having no suspicion of any wicked designs of his, and I wrote to those whom I committed the administration of the affairs of Tiberias by name, that they should provide a lodging for John, and for such as should come with him, and should procure him what necessaries soever he should stand in need of. Now at this time my abode was in the village of Galilee, which is named Cana. But when John was come to the city of Tiberias, he persuaded the men to revolt from their fidelity to me, and to adhere to him, and many of them gladly received that invitation of his, as ever fond of innovations, and by nature disposed to changes, and delighting in seditions. But they were chiefly Justus and his father Pistus that were earnest for their revolt from me, and their adherence to John. But I came upon them and prevented them, for a messenger had come to me from Silas, whom I had made governor of Tiberias, as I have said already, and had told me of the inclinations of the people of Tiberias, and advised me to make haste thither, or to there, for that, if I made any delay, the city would come under another's jurisdiction. Upon the receipt of this letter of Silas, I took 200 men along with me, and travelled all night, having sent before a messenger to let the people of Tiberias know that I was coming to them. When I came near to the city, which was early in the morning, the multitude came out to meet me, and John came with them, and saluted me, but in a most disturbed manner, so being afraid that my coming was to call him to an account for what I was now sensible he was doing. So he in great haste went to his lodging. But when I was in the open place of the city, having dismissed the guards I had about me, excepting 1 and 10 armed men that were with him, I attempted to make a speech to the multitude of the people of Tiberias, and standing on a certain elevated place, I entreated them not to be so hasty in their revolt, for such a change in their behaviour would be to their reproach, and that they would then justly be suspected by those that should be the governors hereafter, as if they were not likely to be faithful to them neither. But before I had spoken all I designed, I heard one of my own domestics bidding me come down, for that it was not a proper time to take care of retaining the good will of the people of Tiberias, but to provide for my own safety, and escape my enemies there. For John had chosen the most trusty of those armed men that were about him, out of those 1,000 that he had with him, and had given them orders where he sent them to kill me, having learned that I was alone, excepting some of my domestics. So those that were sent came as they were ordered, and they had executed what they came about. Had I not leaped down from the elevation I stood on, and with one of my guards, whose name was James, being carried out of the crowd, upon the back of one Herod of Tiberias, and guided by him down to the lake, where I seized the ship, and got into it, and escaped my enemies unexpectedly, and came to Tarichae. Now, as soon as the inhabitants of the city understood that perfidiousness of the people of Tiberias, they were greatly provoked by them. So they snatched up their arms and desired me to be their leader against them, for they said they would avenge their commander's cause upon them. They also carried the report of what had been done to me to all the Galileans, and eagerly endeavoured to irritate them against the people of Tiberias, and desired that vast numbers of them would get together and come to them, that they might act in concert with the commander, what should be determined as fit to be done. Accordingly, the Galileans came to me in great numbers from all parts with their weapons, and besought me to assault Tiberias, to take it by force, and to demolish it till it lay even with the ground, and then to make slaves of its inhabitants, with their wives and children. Those that were Josephus' friends also, and had escaped out of the Tiberias, gave him the same advice. 100. Okay, it's probably a reference to something. But I did not comply with them, thinking it a terrible thing to begin a civil war among you. For I thought that this contention ought not to proceed further than words. Nay, I told them that it was not for me, it was not for their own advantage to do what they would have me to do, while the Romans expected no other than that we should destroy one another by our mutual seditions. And by saying this, I put a stop to the anger of the Galileans. But now John was afraid for himself, since his treachery had proved unsuccessful. So he took the armed men that were about him, and he removed from Tiberias to Gishgala, and wrote to me to apologize for himself concerning what had been done, as if it had been done without his approbation, and desired me to have no suspicion of him to his disadvantage. He also added oaths and certain horrible curses upon himself, and supposed he should be thereby believed in the points he wrote about to me. So he's trying to convince him by those writings that he was sorrowful and all that sort of stuff, had regrets. But now another great number of the Galileans came together with their weapons, as knowing the man, how wicked and how sadly perjured he was, and desired me to lead them against him, and promised me that they would utterly destroy both him and Gishgala. Hereupon I professed that I was obliged to them for their readiness to serve me, and that I would more than requite their good will to me, or pay back their good will to him. However, I entreated them to restrain themselves, and begged of them to give me leave to do what I intended, which was to put an end to these troubles without bloodshed. And when I had prevailed with the multitude of the Galileans to let me do so, I came to Sepphoris. But the inhabitants of the city, having determined to continue in their allegiance to the Romans, were afraid of my coming to them, and tried, by putting me upon another action, to divert me, that they might be freed from the terror they were in. Accordingly they sent to Jesus, the captain of those robbers who were in the confines of Ptolemais, and promised to give him a great deal of money if he would come with those forces he had with him, which were in number 800, and fight with us. Accordingly he complied with what they desired upon the promises that they had made him, and was desirous to fall upon us when we were unprepared for him, and knew nothing of his coming beforehand. So he sent to me, and desired that I would give him leave to come and salute me. When I had given him that leave, which I did without the least knowledge of his treacherous intentions beforehand, he took his band of robbers and made haste to come to me. Yet did not this his knavery succeed well at last, for as he was already nearly approaching, one of those with him deserted him, and came to me, and told me what he had undertaken to do. He was a snitch. He told him his plans, and told me that he had undertaken what he had undertaken to do. When I was informed of this, I went into the marketplace and pretended to know nothing of his treacherous purpose. I took with me many Galileans that were armed, and also some of those of Tiberias. And when I had given orders that all the roads should be carefully guarded, I charged the keepers of the gates to give admittance to none but Jesus when he came, with the principal of his men, and to exclude the rest. In a case they aimed to force themselves in, to use stripes in order to repel them. Accordingly, those that had received such a charge did as they were bidden, and Jesus came in with a few others. This is not Jesus Christ, it's somebody else. Jesus, the name of Jesus was popular, right, in those days and thereafter. And when I had ordered him to throw down his arms immediately and told him that if he refused to do so, he was a dead man, he was seeing armed men standing all around about him, was terrified and complied. And as for those of his followers that were excluded, when they were informed that he was seized, they ran away. I then called Jesus to me by himself and told him that I was not a stranger to that treacherous design he had against me, nor was I ignorant of by whom he was sent for, that however I would forgive him what he had done already, if he would repent of it, and be faithful to me hereafter. And thus, upon his promise to do all that I desired, I let him go and gave him leave to get those whom he had formerly had with him together again. But I threatened the inhabitants of Sepphoris that if they would not leave off their ungrateful treatment of me, I would punish them sufficiently. At this time, it was that two great men who were under the jurisdiction of the king Agrippa came to me out of the region of Trachonitis, bringing their horses and their arms, and carrying with them their money also. And when the Jews would force them to be circumcised, if they would stay among them, I would not permit them to have any force put upon them, but said to them, everyone ought to worship God according to his own inclinations, and not to be constrained by force, and that these men who had fled to us for protection ought not to be so treated as to repent of their coming hither, or coming there. And when I had pacified the multitude, calmed them down, etc., I provided for the men that were come to us whatsoever it was they wanted, according to their useful way of living, or their usual way of living, and that in great piety also. Now King Agrippa sent an army to make themselves masters of the citadel of Gamala, and over it Equicus Modius, but the forces that were sent were not enough to encompass the citadel quite round, but lay before it in the open places and besieged it. But when Ebutius, the decurion who was entrusted with the government of the Great Plain, heard that I was at Simonias, a village situated in the confines of Galilee, and was distant from him 60 furlongs, he took 100 horsemen that was with him by night, and a certain number of footmen, about 200, and brought the inhabitants of the city Gibeah along with him as auxiliaries, and marched in the night and came to the village where I abode. Upon this I pitched my camp over against them, which had a great number of forces in it, but Ebutius tried to draw us down into the plain as greatly depending upon his horsemen, but we would not come down. For when I was satisfied of the advantage that his horse would have if we came down into the plain, while we were all footmen, I received to join battle with the enemy where I was. Now Ebutius and his party made courageous opposition for some time, but when he saw that his horse was useless to him in that place, he retired back to the city Gibeah, having lost 3 of his men in the fight. So I followed him directly with 2,000 armed men, and when I was at the city Posada, that lay in the confines of Ptolemais, but 20 furlongs from Gibeah, where Ebutius abode, I placed my armed men on the outside of the village, and gave orders that they should guard the passes with great care, that the enemy might not disturb us until we should have carried off the corn, a great quantity of which lay there. It belonged to Bernice the Queen, and it had been gathered together out of the neighbouring villages into Posada. So I loaded my camels and asses, or donkeys, and a number of which I had brought along with me, and sent the corn into Galilee. But when I had done this, I offered Ebutius battle, but when he would not accept of the offer, for he was terrified at our readiness and courage, I altered my route and marched towards Neapolitanus, because I had heard that the country about Tiberias was laid waste by him. This Neapolitanus was captain of a troop of horse, and had custody of Scythopolis, and trusted in his care by the enemy. When I had hindered him from doing any further mischief to Tiberias, I set myself to make provision for the affairs of Galilee. But when John, the son of Levi, who, as we before told you, abode at Gishkala, was informed how all the things had succeeded to my mind, and that I was much in favour with those that were under me, as also that the enemy were greatly afraid of me, he was not pleased with it, as thinking my prosperity tended to his ruin, or would be the ruin of him. So he took up a bitter envy and enmity against me, hatred and dislike, in hoping that if he could inflame those that were under me to hate me, he should put an end to the prosperity I was in. He tried to persuade the inhabitants of Tiberias and of Sepphoris, and for those of Gabara, he supposed that they would also of the same mind. They would be also of the same mind with the others, which were the great cities of Galilee, to revolt from the subjection to me and of his party, and told them that he would command them better than I did, and so forth. And he goes into a lot of detail